Have you ever wished you could become someone truly unshakable? Not in the hollow, performative sense of someone who wears a mask of composure while quietly falling apart underneath it, but genuinely, deeply unshakable. Someone who moves through criticism, rejection, loss, and betrayal without being destabilized by any of it. Someone whose inner world remains fundamentally intact regardless of what the outer world delivers. Have you ever allowed yourself to imagine what it would actually feel like to live that way? Not as an occasional good day when things go your way, but as your consistent, reliable, permanent baseline? And alongside that dream, have you felt the weight of its opposite? That silent, persistent pain that lives just beneath the surface of a carefully maintained exterior. The anguish that eats at you from the inside, even on the days when, by every outward measure, you appear to be fine. The exhaustion of keeping the performance going. The constant vigilance required to maintain an image of strength and capability that leaves no room for the simple human need to rest in who you actually are, without apology, without management, without the creeping fear that the moment you let your guard down, something will come along and knock you completely off your feet. Maybe what you are most tired of is not the difficult events themselves. Maybe what exhausts you most is the feeling of powerlessness. The sense that your emotional state is perpetually hostage to things you cannot control. What other people decide to say about you. Whether the outcomes you work toward materialize as you hoped. How the people you care about choose to treat you. Whether circumstances arrange themselves in your favor or against it. Living in this kind of perpetual dependence on external conditions is not just exhausting. It is, in the most literal sense, a form of slavery. Because it means that your inner peace is only ever as secure as the most recent external event, and that anyone who can influence those events has, by extension, influence over you. 2,000 years ago, a group of philosophers identified this condition with unusual precision and developed a systematic framework for escaping it. Not by withdrawing from the world, or suppressing your emotions, or training yourself into a kind of robotic indifference, but through a deep, rigorously examined, thoroughly tested understanding of how your emotional experience actually works. An understanding that locates the source of your suffering in exactly the right place, and therefore points toward its remedy with extraordinary precision. That philosophy is Stoicism. And before we go any further, I want to address the misunderstanding that turns many people away from it before they have given it a genuine hearing. Stoicism is not about emotional suppression. It is not about becoming cold, disconnected, or indifferent to the people and experiences you love. The great Stoics felt deeply. Marcus Aurelius grieved. Seneca loved his friends with evident warmth and wrote about it with tenderness. Epictetus described the inner life with psychological accuracy that remains striking 20 centuries later. What they practiced was not the absence of feeling, but a different and far more mature relationship with feeling. The capacity to experience the full weight of human emotion while remaining the author of your own responses rather than being authored by them. The second misunderstanding worth clearing up is that Stoicism is passive, that accepting what you cannot control means becoming resigned, disengaged, or indifferent to the world's problems and to your own. This is the opposite of what the Stoics practiced. Marcus Aurelius was arguably the most consequential reforming administrator of his era. Seneca advocated with genuine courage for the humane treatment of enslaved people, which was not a comfortable or popular position in Rome. Epictetus built an institution and devoted his life to the intellectual liberation of others. These were not passive people. They were fully engaged with the world, but engaged from a position of inner stability rather than inner desperation. The difference between those two modes of engagement is the difference between someone who acts because they have decided their action is right and someone who acts because they cannot tolerate their anxiety unless they do something, anything, to make the uncomfortable feeling stop. The Stoic engages with full presence and full effort. What they release is not engagement. It is the frantic, grasping quality that comes from needing a particular outcome in order to feel okay. Epictetus, born into literal slavery and eventually freed to become one of the most influential philosophers of his era, stated the essential insight with the directness that characterized everything he taught. People are not disturbed by things, but by the views they take of them. Marcus Aurelius, governing the largest empire in the world while simultaneously facing war, epidemic, political betrayal, and personal grief, wrote in the private journal he never intended to be published. If you're distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. At any moment. Those three words are the entire promise and the entire practice of Stoic philosophy. Not after circumstances improve, not after people start treating you better, not after years of therapy or decades of meditation or some future version of yourself who has finally figured everything out. Right now, in this moment. The judgment that creates your pain is yours, and because it is yours, you can revoke it. What follows is the framework for understanding this, and for practicing it until it becomes not an idea you hold, but a capacity you embody. 7 Stoic truths that, taken seriously and practiced with genuine consistency, have the potential to make you, for the first time in your life, genuinely free.
The first Stoic truth. Nothing external has ever hurt you.
You believe this so thoroughly that it has never occurred to you to question it. What hurts you is out there, in the harsh words directed at you, in the betrayals inflicted on you by people you trusted, in the rejections delivered by people whose approval you wanted, in the losses that have taken from you things and people you loved. The external event happened, and the pain arrived. It feels as simple and as obvious as cause and effect. But the Stoics refused to accept apparent simplicity as a substitute for genuine examination. They looked at this seemingly obvious sequence with their characteristic rigor, asking not what it felt like, but what it actually was. And they found that the common sense account was missing something essential. Between the external event and the experience of pain, there was always something else, something that the common sense account collapsed over and treated as invisible, a judgment, an interpretation, a determination made automatically and almost instantaneously about what the event meant. Epictetus organized all of reality into 2 categories, whose boundary, once genuinely understood, reorganizes your entire relationship with experience. The first category contains everything within your control: your judgments, your interpretations, your values, your character, the effort and intention you bring to your actions. The second category contains everything else: other people's behavior, other people's opinions, outcomes, circumstances, the physical world, and all the events that constitute what we ordinarily call life. The entire Stoic project is built on a single disciplinary commitment. Concentrate your energy and attention exclusively on the first category and cultivate genuine equanimity toward the second. When Epictetus uses the word equanimity or indifference in relation to external events, he is not describing emotional numbness. He is describing something far more interesting and far more demanding: the recognition that external events carry no inherent moral meaning. They are neither good nor bad in themselves. They carry no label. They do not arrive pre-interpreted. They only become threatening or welcome, harmful or beneficial, sources of suffering or sources of opportunity, when you apply a judgment to them. The event is the raw material. Your judgment is the transformation, and judgment, without exception, belongs entirely to the first category. It is within your control. Someone insults you. Follow the actual mechanism rather than the apparent one. The insult, as a physical fact, is a particular arrangement of sound waves in the air, or pixels on a screen. It has no capacity in itself to produce pain. What produces the pain is what happens in the microseconds after the insult is registered. The judgment assembles itself. This insult means I am not respected by this person. This insult confirms something I have feared about how I am perceived by others. This insult threatens my standing, my reputation, my sense of my own worth. These propositions feel like facts. They feel like simple perceptions of what is obviously true, but they are not facts. They are interpretations. They are judgments you are making about what the event means, and they are judgments you could revise. Think about what that actually means in practice. 2 people can receive the exact same insult from the exact same person under the exact same circumstances and walk away with completely different internal experiences. One person is devastated for days, the other barely breaks stride. The external event was identical. The only thing that differed was the judgment each person applied to it. If harm were truly a property of the external event itself, if the insult carried its own capacity to wound, both people would be equally wounded. But that is not what happens. What determines the level of pain is not the event. It is the meaning assigned to the event. And meaning is assembled entirely on the inside. This is not a hypothetical distinction. You have lived it. Think of a time when you received feedback that stung, and then later came to understand it as the most useful thing anyone had ever told you. The words did not change. The person who said them did not change. What changed was your interpretation of what the words meant and what they were for. That shift in interpretation produced a completely different emotional experience from the same raw material. Now ask yourself, which experience was the accurate one? Both were based on the same event. The event did not determine which experience was correct. You did. And if you did it once, if you have ever revised your interpretation of something and felt the emotional experience change accordingly, then the mechanism is already confirmed. You have already done this. Stoicism is simply asking you to do it with intention rather than by accident. Marcus Aurelius, who as emperor faced a continuous stream of insults, conspiracies, and betrayals from people across every level of Roman society, practiced this recognition as a daily discipline. He wrote, "Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been." This is not denial of reality. It is the recognition that harm is not a property of external events. It is a property of judgments made about external events, and you are the sole author of your judgments. Seneca contributed a dimension that brings this into immediate practical focus. He wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." The actual external event, in most cases, is brief and limited in its immediate scope. Someone says something harsh. The exchange itself lasts perhaps 30 seconds, but then the mind refuses to let the event complete itself. It replays the moment in precise, high-definition detail. It rehearses the devastatingly perfect response you did not deliver. It constructs elaborate scenarios about what this person really thinks of you, what they might have said to others, how this reflects a broader pattern that extends back through your history and forward into your future. Every second of this elaboration is suffering that is entirely self-generated. The external event ended half an hour ago. What you are experiencing now is the product of your own mind's activity, and that means it is within the territory of your control. The practice this first truth demands is this: when something triggers a painful response, pause before the automatic interpretation completes itself and ask, what judgment am I making right now that is producing this experience? Someone criticizes your work. Is the pain coming from the criticism or from your interpretation that the criticism confirms your inadequacy? Someone rejects you. Is the hurt coming from the rejection or from your interpretation that the rejection reveals something fundamentally damning about your worth as a person? Locate the judgment. Because the judgment is yours, and what is yours can be examined, questioned, and changed. The second Stoic truth: your suffering proves you are still asleep. The Stoics called the ordinary, unreflective person living in a state of unexamined reaction asleep. This was not a term of contempt. It was a clinical description of a specific condition, the condition of living on autopilot, in which your responses to events are largely automatic, shaped by social conditioning, by the accumulated impressions of past experiences that never received adequate examination, by unconscious patterns installed long before you had the capacity to choose them or to evaluate whether they served you. Most people were never taught that this examination was possible, let alone necessary. They were taught to manage their behavior, navigate social expectations, pursue their goals, and handle the practical business of life. But the question of whether their emotional reactions were rational, necessary, or genuinely chosen, this question was never put to them. And so they grew into adults who experienced their emotional reactions as simply given as the automatic and inevitable output of whatever input the world provides, with no meaningful space between the trigger and the response in which anything other than the automatic reaction could occur. Epictetus drew the essential distinction with characteristic precision. It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Most people receive this as encouragement toward positive thinking or emotional management. But the deeper meaning is about consciousness itself, about whether you are present and choosing your responses, or whether your responses are choosing themselves while you are somewhere else entirely. When something happens and a reaction arises, did you consciously generate that reaction? Or did it simply appear automatically and immediately with no deliberate participation on your part? If it appeared automatically, then in what meaningful sense are you the author of it? The uncomfortable and important truth is that most of what we call our emotional life is not something we create. It is something that happens in us, driven by patterns so deeply embedded and so automatically activated that they have the convincing quality of reality itself rather than the quality of interpretation. When someone disrespects you and anger floods in, it does not feel like a conditioned response running an old program. It feels like the natural and appropriate reaction to what just happened. When someone rejects you and sadness arrives, it does not feel like a story your mind is constructing about what the rejection means. It feels like the direct and inevitable consequence of a painful event. The feeling is so immediate, so thorough, so complete in its occupation of your attention that the idea of questioning it barely arises. There is no space in which questioning could occur. Consider how early these patterns were installed. Many of the most deeply automatic emotional responses you have today were formed in the first decade of your life, in environments where you had no philosophical framework, no emotional vocabulary, and no capacity for the kind of detached examination that could have given you a choice about whether to keep them. A child who learned that anger directed at them meant danger did not choose to become hypervigilant to other people's moods. A child who learned that failure brought withdrawal of love did not choose to tie their self-worth to their achievements. These patterns were written into the nervous system at a time when the nervous system had no way to opt out. And now, decades later, they run in the background of adult life with the same automatic authority they had in childhood, because they have never been examined, never been questioned, never been consciously put to the test of whether they still serve the person you are now. But Marcus Aurelius created that space. Every day, in the pages of a private journal, never intended for any eyes but his own, he examined his reactions with a rigor and an honesty that is striking precisely because he was one of the most powerful people alive and had every external justification for believing his judgments were simply correct. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The realization he is describing is not an intellectual achievement completed once. It is a practice, a daily, active, effortful discipline of catching the automatic reactions before they run to completion and asking whether they are the product of genuine reason or the product of conditioning that has never been questioned. Seneca added the dimension that makes this practically urgent. We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. Your unconscious mind, left unexamined, is a remarkably efficient and remarkably indiscriminate threat detection system. It is constantly scanning for danger, constantly constructing worst-case scenarios, constantly interpreting ambiguous events through the lens of past experiences in which similar events preceded genuine difficulty. This is not a malfunction, it is a survival mechanism, and in certain environments, it is exactly what keeps you safe. But in the ordinary circumstances of a contemporary life, where most of the threats your unconscious is responding to are social and relational rather than physical and immediate, this mechanism produces enormous amounts of suffering in response to events that, examined carefully, present no genuine danger at all. The Stoic practice of self-examination begins with a simple question that becomes, through consistent use, one of the most powerful tools available to a human being. When something triggers you, when the familiar reaction begins to arise, pause and ask, what judgment am I making right now that is creating this experience? You will discover, if you ask this question honestly and with genuine patience, that between every external event and every emotional reaction, there is always a judgment. The event happened, the judgment interpreted it, the emotion followed from the interpretation. The event and the emotion feel directly connected, but the judgment is always in the middle, operating so fast and so automatically that it is effectively invisible until you develop the specific practice of looking for it. Once you can see it, everything changes, because you cannot change what you cannot see. And once you can see your own judgments operating in real time, once you can catch yourself in the act of interpreting rather than simply perceiving, you have access to a degree of authorship over your emotional experience that the sleepwalking person never has. The third Stoic truth. True invulnerability comes from accepting what you cannot control. The strategy most people employ to protect themselves from emotional pain is some version of control. Control how people treat you by managing their perceptions carefully enough. Control outcomes by working hard enough, planning thoroughly enough, anticipating every variable. Control your environment so that the conditions that have previously produced pain do not recur. This strategy feels rational, it feels active and empowered, and it fails with such reliable consistency that the people who have pursued it most diligently are often the most exhausted and the most defeated, precisely because they have invested the most in an approach that the nature of reality makes fundamentally unworkable. The world is not controllable, not in the ways that would provide reliable protection from pain. Other people will do what they will do, driven by their own nature, their own fears, their own conditioning, their own choices. Outcomes will emerge from the intersection of your efforts and countless other variables you did not design and cannot manage. Circumstances will arrange themselves without consulting your preferences. This is not a pessimistic observation. It is simply an accurate description of the nature of reality, a description that the Stoics made with complete clarity and without the resentment or disappointment that comes from expecting reality to be otherwise. Their response to this description was a strategic reallocation of effort that is, once understood, both intellectually obvious and psychologically revolutionary. Rather than attempting to control what cannot be controlled, they concentrated all of their energy on controlling what genuinely can be. And what can genuinely be controlled is precisely and only the territory that Epictetus identified as the first category: your judgments, your reactions, your values, your character, the effort and intention you bring to your choices. This is not a small territory. It is the most important territory. It is the territory that determines the quality of your inner life, regardless of what the outer world delivers. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire, which meant he was surrounded by an unusually dense concentration of things he could not control. The barbarian tribes pressing at the empire's borders did not stop pressing because the emperor preferred peace. The plague that moved through Rome in waves did not relent because the emperor had other priorities. The political conspiracies that formed and reformed around the imperial court did not cease because the emperor valued loyalty. The corruption that developed in his son, despite the extraordinary care Marcus brought to his parenting, did not correct itself in response to his wishes. None of this was within his control. What was within his control was his response. Not his feelings about each situation, which arose naturally and were real, but his judged response. The quality of character, the clarity of reason, the degree of genuine virtue he brought to each situation regardless of the situation's nature. He wrote, "Accept whatever comes to you woven in the pattern of your destiny, for what could more aptly fit your needs." Read carefully, this statement is not resignation. It is a recognition that the energy spent fighting what cannot be changed is energy unavailable for addressing what can be. When you stop struggling against the irreversible, you do not become weaker. You become available to address what is genuinely within your reach with the full weight of your capacity rather than the depleted remainder left after the exhausting and futile struggle against reality has taken its toll. There is a psychological cost to unwinnable struggles that rarely gets named directly. When you spend months or years pushing against something that has no mechanism for yielding to your pressure, the damage is not just the wasted time and wasted energy. It is the slow accumulation of the experience of failure. Each day, the immovable thing fails to move. You receive what the nervous system registers as evidence of your own inadequacy. Not because you are inadequate, but because you chose the wrong battlefield. You brought real effort to an unwinnable fight, and the fight did not care. Shifting the battlefield to what is actually within your control does not just save energy. It changes the entire psychological experience of engaging with life. Because now your effort and your results are genuinely connected, and the connection is reliable. There is also a subtler version of the control trap that is worth naming directly, because it is so common and so rarely recognized as a trap at all. It is the attempt to control your own emotional responses directly, to will yourself into feeling differently about something, to command the anxiety to stop, to instruct the grief to end, to demand that the anger calm down right now. This approach has the same fundamental flaw as trying to control other people's behavior. It is an attempt to exert direct authority over something that does not respond to direct authority. You cannot instruct your emotions into compliance any more than you can instruct the weather. What you can do, what you actually have genuine authority over, is the judgment that produced the emotion in the first place. Change the judgment, and the emotion follows. Try to change the emotion directly while leaving the judgment intact, and you will exhaust yourself in a struggle that the structure of your own mind makes unwinnable. The practical application of this truth in specific situations is direct and immediately testable. Someone in your life has betrayed you. The betrayal has happened. It is now a fact of reality, fixed in the past, beyond any power you possess to change. What remains within your control is the judgment you apply to it. You can interpret it as evidence of your unworthiness, as confirmation that you are someone who does not merit loyalty, who attracts betrayal, who was naive to have trusted in the first place. This judgment is available to you. It will produce ongoing suffering, or you can interpret it as information, specific, limited, relevant information about the character of the person who made that choice, information that has no bearing on your own worth and that equips you to make better decisions about trust going forward. This judgment is equally available to you. It will produce clarity and, in time, wisdom. Both interpretations fit the facts. Only one of them serves you. Seneca wrote, "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials." The Stoic does not pursue difficulty, but the Stoic treats difficulty as the mechanism of development rather than as evidence of misfortune. Every challenge that lies outside your control but demands a response is an opportunity to practice the precise skill that this philosophy is building, the capacity to determine your own inner state regardless of what external conditions are doing. Each situation successfully navigated, not avoided but navigated with the quality of character you are committed to developing, adds to a growing and personally verified body of evidence that you are more capable of self-determination than you previously believed. The fourth Stoic truth: suffering is optional. Pain is not. This is one of the most important and most frequently misunderstood distinctions in the entire Stoic system. Pain and suffering are not the same thing. They are not interchangeable words for the same experience. They have different sources, different durations, and crucially, a different relationship to your choices and your practice. Pain is the immediate, direct, natural emotional response to a genuinely difficult event. It is the grief that arrives when someone you love dies. It is the hurt that comes when a relationship you valued ends. It is the disappointment that follows genuine failure at something that mattered. Pain of this kind is real, is human, is entirely legitimate, and is not something that Stoic philosophy asks you to eliminate or suppress. The Stoics were not advocates of emotional amputation. They recognized that the capacity to feel deeply, including the capacity to feel pain, is part of what makes a human life worth living. A person who felt nothing in the face of loss, who experienced no grief at the death of someone beloved, would not be wiser than the rest of us. They would be impoverished. Suffering is something different in kind. Suffering is what the mind adds to pain through the stories it tells about pain. It is the rumination that takes a painful experience and extends it indefinitely. It is the catastrophizing that takes a specific limited hurt and uses it as evidence for sweeping conclusions about your worth, your future, your fundamental nature, and the fairness of the universe. It is the elaborate construction of meaning around an event, meaning that exists entirely in your interpretation, not in the event itself, and it is this construction that transforms pain, which would naturally complete itself and pass, into suffering, which can persist for years. Here is a way to see the difference clearly. Imagine two people who both lose their job on the same day. The pain of that event, the shock, the disappointment, the fear about what comes next, is real and legitimate for both of them. It would be inhuman to feel nothing. But watch what happens in the days that follow. The first person feels the pain, allows it to be what it is, and begins looking at what is actually within their control, updating their resume, reaching out to contacts, thinking carefully about what they want next. The pain is present, but it does not grow. It does not expand beyond the event that produced it. The second person, not because they are weaker, but because they have not yet developed this particular skill, allows the mind to run. The story builds. This happened because I am not good enough. Every employer will eventually see what this employer saw. This is just the latest proof of a pattern that goes all the way back to school, all the way back to what my father used to say. I will never be truly secure. I am fundamentally unsuited to success. None of this is in the event. All of it is in the story. And it is the story, not the event, that produces the months of suffering that follow. Marcus Aurelius experienced the death of multiple children. The pain of those losses was real, fully felt. and never denied. But what he refused to add was the layer of suffering, the narrative of injustice, the question of why this happened to him specifically, the judgment that the universe was cruel or that his life had been uniquely visited with tragedy. He understood that death belongs to the nature of all living things, that his children were not exceptions to this reality, that the question available to him was not why this had happened, to which no satisfying answer existed, but how he would respond to it, which was entirely within his control. Epictetus taught, "Demand not that events should happen as you wish, but wish them to happen as they do happen, and you will go on well." This is the precise mechanism by which suffering is ended while pain is not denied. Suffering is generated by the gap between what is and what you insist should be, by the persistent demand that reality be different from what it is, and by the distress that floods into that gap every time reality fails to comply. When you stop insisting, when you genuinely accept the current situation as the current situation rather than as a deviation from the situation that should exist, the suffering dissolves, not because the pain is gone, but because the story that was amplifying and extending the pain has been withdrawn. Consider what happens in the experience of criticism. Someone criticizes your work, your choices, your judgment. There is a moment of sting, brief, specific, located in time. That is pain. Natural, understandable, not itself a problem. But then observe what the mind does with it in the seconds and minutes that follow, if left unexamined. It constructs a structure of meaning. This criticism means I am not as capable as I believed. This criticism confirms what I have secretly feared about my adequacy. This criticism is evidence of a pattern that extends back through my history and will continue into my future. Other people have noticed what this person has just said out loud. My credibility is damaged. My confidence was misplaced. None of this is contained in the criticism. All of it is added by the mind. And all of it is suffering, unnecessary, self-generated, optional suffering that the original pain did not require and did not produce. The Stoic practice when pain arises is to feel it fully without elaborating on it, to acknowledge the genuine emotional response without constructing a narrative about what it implies about your worth or your future, to let the pain be what it is, specific, temporary, limited to the event that produced it, rather than feeding it with interpretations that give it scope and duration far beyond what the event itself contains. Pain, when not fed with story, moves through and completes itself in a way that is genuinely bearable. It is the story told about pain, the suffering layered on top of it, that can persist for weeks, months, years, long after the original event has passed into the category of history. The fifth Stoic truth: your character is the only thing that can actually be harmed. Here is the reframing that, when genuinely absorbed, changes what you understand the word harm to mean at its most fundamental level. The Stoics believed, not as a philosophical comfort offered to soften difficult realities, but as a rigorously examined and thoroughly defended conclusion, that the only thing capable of genuinely harming a human being is damage to their character. Everything else that we ordinarily classify as harm, loss of money, loss of status, loss of relationships, physical pain, public humiliation, social rejection, they classified as externally indifferent, meaning these things carry no inherent positive or negative value. They are neutral facts of existence that can be responded to wisely or unwisely, but that carry no harm in themselves independent of the judgment applied to them. What is genuinely harmful in the Stoic framework? Acting against your own principles when pressure to do so arrives, compromising your integrity to avoid a difficult consequence, allowing fear to dictate choices that your values would direct differently, responding to being treated badly by becoming someone who treats others badly, reacting to betrayal with a bitterness that slowly corrodes your capacity for trust and connection. These are genuine forms of harm because they damage the only thing you truly own in an unconditional sense, the quality of your character, and because the damage is done not by external events but by your own choices in response to them. Pay attention to how that last point lands. The damage is not done by external events. It is done by your choices in response to them. Which means that in the Stoic framework, you are never simply a victim of what others do to you. You are always a participant in what their actions eventually make of you, through the quality of the choices you make in the space between what happened and how you responded. Someone treats you cruelly. The cruelty is not within your control, but whether their cruelty gradually makes you cruel in return, whether it installs in you a bitterness, a defensiveness, a tendency to assume the worst about people before they have shown you who they are, that is within your control, and that is where the genuine danger lives. It is worth sitting with the specific ways this happens in ordinary life, because the mechanism is rarely dramatic and therefore rarely visible in the moment it is occurring. It happens when you are passed over for something you deserved, and you let the resentment harden into a permanent suspicion of the people who make those decisions. It happens when someone you trusted uses your honesty against you, and you quietly resolve never to be that honest with anyone again. It happens when you are humiliated publicly, and you compensate for the vulnerability by building a harder, more defended version of yourself, one that is safer perhaps, but also smaller, less open, less capable of the kind of genuine engagement that makes life worth living. Each of these responses is understandable. Each of them begins as a reasonable protective adjustment to a painful experience, and each of them, if not examined and consciously addressed, represents exactly the form of harm the Stoics identified as genuine, the slow erosion of your character by a series of unconscious choices made in the aftermath of events that did not deserve that much power over you. Marcus Aurelius expressed this with the honesty that characterizes his best writing. If someone can prove me wrong and show me my mistake in any thought or action, I shall gladly change. I seek the truth, which never harmed anyone. The harm is to persist in one's own self-deception and ignorance. Notice what he identifies as harm in this passage. Not the criticism, not the correction, not the external challenge to his judgment, or the loss of face that might accompany being shown publicly to be wrong. What is harmful is the response to criticism that protects the image at the expense of the truth, the choice to remain mistaken rather than to acknowledge error, because acknowledging error feels threatening. That self-deception is where the genuine damage occurs. Everything else is simply what happened. Epictetus taught this truth in the form that remains most immediately applicable. No one can harm you without your consent. What he meant was neither naive nor dismissive of the genuine ways in which people can affect you. People can steal from you, insult you, damage your reputation, physically hurt you. These things happen. They are real. But they cannot make you act against your principles unless you choose to allow it. They cannot make you respond to cruelty with cruelty unless you consent to that response. They cannot corrupt your character unless you permit the corruption. And in the Stoic framework, where character is everything, where the quality of who you are is the only genuine measure of how well you are living, this means that the most important thing is permanently and unconditionally protected from external attack. The practical consequence of genuinely understanding this is a complete reorientation of where you direct your protective energy. Most people spend enormous resources trying to protect their reputation, their standing, their relationships, their comfort, all things in the second category. All things that are, in the Stoic framework, genuinely outside your control. The Stoic directs all of that protective energy inward, toward the one thing that is actually theirs to protect, the quality of their character and the integrity of their responses to whatever life delivers. Someone can take many things from you. They cannot take the quality of who you are unless you hand it to them. And understanding this, really understanding it, in a way that reaches from the intellectual level down into the automatic responses of daily life, produces a form of security that no external circumstance can threaten, because it does not depend on external circumstances cooperating. The sixth Stoic truth: freedom is internal, not external. Epictetus was a slave when he began developing the philosophy that would eventually influence centuries of human thought. Literally owned by another person, with no legal rights, no freedom of movement, no control over the basic conditions of his daily existence. By every external measure available to the Roman world, he was among the least free people alive, and yet he became, in the recognition of his contemporaries and of everyone who has read his teachings since, one of the freest human beings in history. This paradox is not rhetorical. It is the precise and literal demonstration of the sixth Stoic truth. Epictetus understood, and his circumstances made this understanding unavoidable, that true freedom, the freedom that matters, the freedom that determines the quality of your inner life, is not conferred by external conditions. It cannot be granted by political arrangements or social structures, though these matter enormously for human welfare and dignity. And it cannot be taken away by the absence of those arrangements, though their absence creates suffering that is real and should not be minimized. True freedom is the freedom to determine your own judgments, your own values, your own responses, and this freedom was available to Epictetus in chains. It is available to you in whatever your actual circumstances are. He taught freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control. Look at this teaching carefully, because it contains something counterintuitive that is easy to miss. The path to freedom is not the acquisition of more external goods, more security, more approval, more success, more comfort, more control over circumstances. The path to freedom is the relinquishment of attachment to these things, not the elimination of preference. The Stoics were not asking you to become indifferent to everything, but the liberation from the tyranny of need, the distinction between preferring something and requiring it, between appreciating what you have and being enslaved to the fear of losing it. Most people living in societies with extensive external freedoms are in practice deeply unfree. They are enslaved to other people's opinions in a way that shapes their choices, restricts their authentic expression, and keeps them in a perpetual state of management and performance. They are enslaved to outcomes, experiencing their emotional baseline as a direct function of whether recent events have gone their way, which means their contentment is never more secure than the most recent result. They are enslaved to the need for validation, requiring regular confirmation from external sources that they are adequate, valuable, worthy of regard, before they can feel settled in themselves. These are not marginal forms of unfreedom. They are among the most pervasive and most invisible sources of suffering in contemporary life. Think about what the need for approval actually costs you on a daily basis. It costs you the ability to make decisions based on your own genuine assessment of what is right. It costs you the ability to say things that need to be said when you suspect the other person won't want to hear them. It costs you the ability to pursue paths that feel true to you when those paths don't match what the people around you recognize as success. Approval seeking is not a personality quirk. It is an invisible fence around your life, defining the territory within which you are free to move and excluding everything outside it. And the fence is held in place not by anyone else's authority over you, but by your own belief that their approval is something you genuinely need in order to be okay. Remove that belief, and the fence disappears. Not the relationships, not the genuine care about how others experience you, just the grip of the need, just the tyranny of the requirement. And here is what makes the internal work of developing this freedom so practically significant. It changes the quality of everything you do in the external world, without requiring you to withdraw from it. When you are not acting from a need for approval, your actions become cleaner because they are no longer contaminated by the background calculation of how this will be received. When you are not attached to specific outcomes, your efforts become more wholehearted because you are no longer holding back the portion of yourself that you are reserving in case the outcome disappoints you. When you are not dependent on circumstances being arranged in a particular way to feel okay, your engagement with whatever circumstances actually exist becomes more full, more present, more genuinely effective. The internal freedom does not pull you away from the world. It gives you back to it, fully, without the split attention of someone who is simultaneously living their life and managing their reaction to the possibility that it might not go well. Marcus Aurelius, who possessed more external power than almost any person who has ever lived, was utterly clear about where his real power lived. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The remarkable thing about this statement is its context. He was not a person forced to redirect attention inward because external resources were unavailable to him. He had every external resource, and he was telling himself, in his private journal, in the most honest voice available to him, that his real power was internal, that the legions and the treasury and the imperial authority were fragile, contingent and temporary. His character, his reason, his virtue, these were permanent, and in the sense that mattered most, fully his. Seneca approached this from the angle of sufficiency. He asked what a person genuinely needs, and his answer was characteristically precise. First, having what is essential, and second, having what is enough. Apply this internally. What is essential? Virtue, reason, the integrity of your character. What is enough? The same. Everything else, approval, success, comfort, security, the admiration of others, belongs to the category of things that can be appreciated when present and released without devastating loss when absent. This is not the counsel of someone who does not value these things. It is the counsel of someone who has examined what happens to a person who makes these things necessary, who has seen how the need for external goods creates exactly the vulnerability that makes genuine inner peace impossible, and has concluded that the path to real security runs through the reduction of necessity, not the accumulation of more of what you have come to need. When you no longer require approval to feel adequate, the withholding of approval loses its power. When you no longer require specific outcomes to feel secure, the uncertainty of outcomes loses its power. When you no longer require people to behave in particular ways to maintain your peace, their behavior loses its power. This is what genuine freedom looks like from the inside. Not the absence of preference, not indifference to people or to outcomes, but independence from the need to have them arranged in particular ways in order to function. You can care deeply while remaining free. You can invest fully while remaining unattached to the specific forms your investment takes. You can love without requiring the loved person to perform love in the exact way that your history has conditioned you to expect. This is the internal freedom that Epictetus discovered in chains, that Marcus Aurelius practiced on a throne, and that is available to you right now in whatever circumstances you currently inhabit. The final truth: practice makes permanent. Everything explored in these 6 Stoic truths, that nothing external has ever hurt you, that your suffering reflects the degree to which you are still operating unconsciously, that true invulnerability comes from accepting what you cannot control, that suffering is optional even when pain is not, that your character is the only thing that can genuinely be harmed, and that true freedom is internal. All of this is, without exception, useless unless it is practiced. This is not a caveat. It is the most important sentence in this entire video, because the history of human self-help and philosophical reflection is littered with people who understood beautiful truths intellectually and whose lives were unchanged by them. The Stoics were not a philosophical school that gathered to discuss ideas and then returned home to their ordinary unconscious patterns. They were practitioners. Daily, disciplined, utterly committed practitioners who worked these principles with the systematic intentionality of an athlete training a physical skill, with the complete understanding that knowledge without practice is entertainment, that comprehension without integration is vanity, and that the goal was not to be able to articulate these ideas, but to be so thoroughly shaped by them that they became your automatic response to whatever life presented. Marcus Aurelius had read Stoic philosophy his entire adult life. He had discussed it with teachers, he understood it intellectually as thoroughly as anyone, and still, every morning of his reign, he returned to his journal to work through the same principles again, to remind himself of the dichotomy of control, to examine his reactions from the previous day, to recommit to the values he had spent years understanding. Not because the ideas were unclear to him, because the gap between intellectual understanding of a principle and consistent, reliable, embodied practice of it is vast, and is only crossed through repetition. Through the accumulated evidence of having applied the principle in real situations, noticed where it worked and where it failed, adjusted the practice accordingly, and applied it again. Epictetus ran a school precisely because he understood that the ideas were only transformative in the context of practice. Real students, real situations, real triggers, real opportunities to catch the automatic reaction before it ran to completion and choose something different. His school was less a classroom than a training environment. And the training never stopped because the challenges never stopped presenting themselves. This is the part that the self-improvement industry consistently gets wrong. It presents insight as the destination. You read the book, you watch the video, you attend the seminar, you have the breakthrough moment of recognition, and the implicit promise is that the recognition itself produces the change. It doesn't. The recognition is the beginning of the work, not the completion of it. What produces the change is the daily, repetitive, patient application of the insight in real situations, in the moments when someone says something that triggers you and you have about half a second to decide whether you are going to respond consciously or react automatically. In those moments, the intellectual understanding of the principle does not help you. What helps you is the 10-second gap you have built into your responses through consistent practice. What helps you is the habit, accumulated through repetition, of pausing before reacting. The insight gets you started. The practice gets you there. And the reason repetition is necessary, the reason Marcus Aurelius returned to the same principles every single morning despite understanding them completely, is that understanding lives in the prefrontal cortex, the deliberate thinking part of your mind. But your automatic reactions live somewhere much older and much faster than that. They live in parts of the brain that were handling threats before language existed, before philosophy existed, before the capacity for reflective self-examination existed. When a trigger fires, those old systems respond first. They are faster than your intellectual understanding by a significant margin. The only thing that teaches the old systems a new response pattern is repetition. Not understanding, not insight. Repetition. Doing the thing over and over, in real situations with real stakes, until the new response has accumulated enough repetitions to begin competing with the old one on speed. That is what practice builds, not knowledge. Reflex. Your practice begins each morning, before the day has made its first demands, before the email has arrived, before the news has delivered whatever it has decided to deliver, before the first interpersonal challenge has presented itself. Take a few minutes to prepare, not in an elaborate or time-consuming way. Simply remind yourself of what you can and what you cannot control. Remind yourself that the people you will encounter today will include some who are acting from fear, from conditioning, from patterns they have never examined, and that their behavior is not within your control and does not require your suffering as its consequence. Remind yourself that your response to every situation, every person, every outcome, every circumstance is yours to choose, that between every trigger and every reaction, a space exists, and that your practice is the discipline of finding that space and using it. Marcus Aurelius prepared himself explicitly each morning for the human reality he was about to encounter. He reminded himself that the people he would deal with would sometimes be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, and difficult. This was not pessimism, it was preparation. He was ensuring that when these things happened, as they inevitably did, he encountered them not as surprises that destabilized his equilibrium, but as expected features of the landscape that his practice had equipped him to navigate without internal disruption. End each evening with honest review. This is the Stoic equivalent of the athlete watching the tape, not to generate self-criticism, not to confirm your inadequacy, but with genuine and curious inquiry. When did I react unconsciously today? When did the automatic reaction arrive before I had the chance to find the space? When did I feel the familiar pull of suffering, the story constructing itself around pain, and either interrupt it or allow it to run? When did I respond from my values, and when did I respond from my conditioning? Each honest answer to these questions is information that improves tomorrow's practice. Not because failure today means failure tomorrow, but because understood failure is the most efficient teacher available. Seneca had a specific practice here that is worth adopting directly. He reviewed each day by asking 3 questions in sequence. Where did I go wrong today? What did I do right? What could I have done better? 3 questions asked in honest sequence, without the distortion of self-punishment at one extreme or self-congratulation at the other. The goal of the review is not to feel good or bad about the day, it is to learn from it. The Stoics treated their own behavior as data, not as a referendum on their worth as a person, but as information about where the practice was working and where it still needed development. That distinction matters enormously. When you treat your failures as data rather than as verdicts, the review becomes genuinely useful instead of something to avoid. Some evenings the review will reveal that you navigated genuinely difficult moments with the kind of conscious, grounded response that you would be proud of. Those are important data points. They are personally verified evidence that the practice is working, that you are in real situations under real pressure, actually doing what you are working to build. Other evenings, the review will reveal that you reacted automatically, said something you did not mean, allowed someone else's behavior to pull you entirely off center. These are equally important data points, and they are not evidence of failure. They are the raw material of refinement. The practice does not require perfection. It requires honesty and continuation. And in the real-time moments between morning preparation and evening review, in the specific, textured, personally challenging moments when the trigger fires and the familiar reaction begins, practice the pause. Not as a suppression of feeling, which is both impossible and counterproductive to everything the Stoics were building, as a deliberate interruption of the automatic sequence that creates space for a different choice. Is this within my control? If it is not, can I genuinely accept it? What judgment am I making right now that is producing this experience? Is that judgment necessary? Is it accurate? Can I revoke it, or modify it, or replace it with one that is equally truthful and more genuinely useful? These questions will not always produce the ideal response. There will be mornings when you skip the preparation. There will be evenings when the review is perfunctory. There will be triggered moments when the reaction is fully complete before the practice even enters your awareness, when you are halfway through a response that your values would not have chosen, and there is nothing to do but notice it, learn from it, and commit to the next moment with more awareness. All of this is expected. It is the texture of genuine practice, and it is entirely different from failure. Failure is never practicing at all. Everything else is the actual work. The developmental arc of this practice follows a reliable progression for everyone who engages with it seriously. In the beginning, the understanding is intellectual, but largely unavailable in real-time triggering situations. By the time you remember to pause, the reaction has already run. Then, gradually, you begin catching yourself in the middle of the reaction, aware of the pattern while it is running, with enough presence to observe it even without immediately changing it. Then you catch it slightly earlier, at the beginning of the reaction, with enough space to make a partial choice rather than a complete automatic response. And then, with sustained practice over sufficient time, the pause becomes the new default. The question arrives before the reaction. The judgment is visible before it has fully operated, and the person who previously needed to remember to be conscious finds that consciousness has become, through practice, the new automatic. This progression is not linear. It does not move forward without setbacks. There will be periods of what feels like regression, weeks when you seem to be reacting more automatically than you did months ago, when the practice feels like it is going nowhere, when the gap between who you want to be and how you are actually responding seems as wide as it ever was. These periods are part of the process, not exceptions to it. They are the places where the practice is being tested under conditions that previous stages of the practice had not yet reached. The response to apparent regression is not self-criticism, it is recommitment. The practice resumes exactly where it is, in the next moment, with whatever consciousness is available. What you will notice, across months of this kind of honest engagement, is something that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it, but immediately recognizable to anyone who has. A gradual shift in what feels threatening. Things that used to hijack your attention for hours begin to pass in minutes. Criticism that used to send you into a spiral of self-doubt begins to arrive as information rather than as verdict. Rejection that used to feel like evidence of fundamental inadequacy begins to feel like one person's assessment, relevant or not on its own terms, but carrying no authority over your understanding of your own worth. The world has not gotten easier. What has changed is you specifically, the quality and the speed of the judgment you apply to what the world delivers. And that change, accumulated through practice, is the definition of genuine development. The person whose equanimity you most admire, the person who seems to move through criticism, rejection, and difficulty with a groundedness that has seemed to you like a gift rather than an achievement, arrived where they are through exactly this progression. One triggered moment at a time. Through more inconsistency and recommitment than the finished picture reveals, they were not born with it. They did not receive it as a sudden insight that transformed them permanently in a single weekend. They built it, the same way every enduring capacity is built, through repeated contact with difficult material, handled with whatever degree of consciousness was available, gradually refined by honest review and patient recommitment. The same path is available to you. It does not require unusual temperament or exceptional circumstances or a past that was easier than yours. It requires practice. Consistent, patient, honest, daily practice of principles that are now for the first time genuinely clear to you. The only power that external events have ever had over your inner life is the power you gave them through your judgments. That is the complete summary of everything we have explored. Not a comfort offered to make difficulty easier, but a precise and accurate description of the mechanism by which your suffering is produced and by which it can be ended. Your judgments are yours. They have always been yours. They were yours in every difficult moment you have ever lived through, even when you did not know it, even when it felt as though the situation left you no choice. The choice was always there. Now you can see it, and now you know it. Welcome to the beginning of Stoic freedom.